Good afternoon, everybody. I am going to call to order the Governance and Priorities Committee meeting for December 8, 2025. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of Snuneymuxw First Nation, and our clerk today is Ms. Sheila Gurry. Everyone is attendance here in person, so no need to acknowledge anyone virtually. And as we're following another meeting, I'm not going to read out the big list of how to behave in the chambers, but Ms. Gurry, any late items?
I am just looking for that, Mr. Chair. I'm so sorry. For late items this afternoon, there doesn't seem to be any.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gurry. Council, we would need a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Councillor Thorpe, second by Councillor Hemmens. Any discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? None opposed. The agenda is adopted. There is no minutes for consideration, which brings us to item 5, agenda planning, upcoming topics and initiatives. Over to Ms. Gurry, but I believe the e-scribe is again incorrect with the document attached. So,
Really? So, and it was last time that it was incorrect. It was correct on mine and Mr. Lindsay's, but incorrect on Councillor Gusser-Brock's and Councillor Armstrong's. So you're saying it's incorrect on yours as well, hey?
yeah.
Okay, and yours as well? Okay, so we will have to follow up with eScribe again on that. My apologies. I'm really not sure what's happening, if it's right on some and not on the others. So what you should have, and maybe Ms. Monaco could try to bring it up on the screen, the upcoming topics and initiatives. This is what you should have on your eScribe. So again, I'll follow up with eScribe on this. It's an eScribe issue. You have January 26th, the upcoming topics that have already been approved by council, and what is scheduled for the 26th is on there. So you have implementation of the Alan Nielsen building permit function review and the recommendation. So that was from your May 12th, 2025 meeting. And they're coming back with those recommendations. And then you also have the analysis of urban center and corridor land use designations. And this is a report from staff with the objective to pre-zone appropriate parcels for non-market housing. So this is an IAP priority action. And then future 2026 GPC meetings, dates still to be determined based on when staff are ready to prepare these, and or we have presenters coming that are ready to attend. We have incentives that support city plan, building bylaw, and guidelines for the application of frontage works and services requirements. So looking at that bylaw and policies related to that, as well as zoning bylaw review, which is an IAP priority action to review options and themes for updating the city's zoning bylaws. So those are all for dates to be determined in January. You've recently approved your key date calendar for GPC meetings in 2026. So I think that's the next page on your agenda. And so we will look to either to punch in those topics on those specific dates. And if any members of the committee right now have anything that they'd like to add and or see in the new year, now would be the appropriate time to make that motion.
Thank you, Ms. Gurry. Council. All right. Seeing nothing? We can wait till the new year to add new topics. Which brings us to item 6A1, Neighborhood Zero Emission Vehicle Bylaw. Mr. Sims.
Thanks, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to be in front of council with this report. I'll just pass it straight over to Fraser Ma, our transportation engineer.
Great. Good afternoon. So today we're going over a report following up on a council motion to present some options for allowing neighborhood zero emission vehicles on city streets. So we've compiled some of those options, and we'll take you through sort of some of the alternatives that we look for recommendation to advance. So some of the background on this topic, neighborhood zero emission vehicles, I'll say NZEVs from here on. You'll also often hear low speed vehicles, LSVs, or neighborhood electric vehicles, NEVs. It's a bit of a nebulous regulatory environment, or regulatory and manufacturing environment in that regard, but NZEVs were added to the Motor Vehicle Act of BC in 2008. They're defined as a vehicle that travels on 4 wheels, that can achieve 32 kilometers an hour, but not more than 40 kilometers an hour. and that has been met the standards of the Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which is federal guideline. And then in terms of where they can operate, they're allowed in the BCMVA on any streets that have a posted speed limit of 40 kilometers an hour or lower, or where authorized by the municipal authority to go on roads up to 50 kilometers an hour posted speed limit. So with the report that was brought previously with the motion, there was discussion on some of the alternatives that have been presented in other municipalities. I've kind of lumped them into three main categories. Some municipalities or jurisdictions have taken the approach of defining a specific geographical area within their boundaries that these NZEVs are allowed to operate in. Some have taken the approach of specifically incorporating the NZEVs as a permitted vehicle on any streets within the municipality. And some of the examples there, Vancouver, Oak Bay, and New Westminster, but there's quite a few. And then other municipalities have taken an approach where this not specifically with the explicit intent of permitting NZEVs, but where other municipalities are lowering blanket speed zones throughout the province, it effectively allows those NZEVs to operate under the BC Motor Vehicle Act rules around operating on roads of 40 kilometers an hour or under. So some of the areas, Victoria, Duncan, and Courtenay, have taken that approach. So looking at the Nanaimo context, we don't currently have an explicitly NZEV-related bylaw or component in our Traffic and Highways bylaw, but in that Traffic and Highways bylaw 5000, we have a section related to slow-moving vehicles, which sets out the requirements for vehicles that are operating below the typical operating speeds on the road, and defined as typically meant to be operating around 40 kilometers an hour. And the requirement is essentially just having the orange kind of a triangle placard on the back of the vehicle at a certain height, which aligns with the definitions of the NZEVs and slow-moving vehicle requirements in the Motor Vehicle Act. So moving into the options, in completing that review, staff are recommending the option that essentially our bylaws as they exist with that slow-moving vehicle section of the Traffic and Highways bylaw would cover the operation of an NZEV on the streets. So we're recommending that we proceed with that. The other alternatives that we've included are passing a specific bylaw that would address the use of NZEVs on the street, which would provide a bit more kind of explicit guidance for somebody who might be looking for that, but of course would require additional time for putting that bylaw together. And then the two other options that we've included in there would be looking at amendments to the Traffic and Highways bylaw, either to do that geographic approach, where we designate a specific area, or to start looking at the lowered speed zones that I was mentioning, as some of the other municipalities have gone in that direction, which by kind of default allows NZEVs to operate there. The Traffic and Highways bylaw being a more substantial bylaw, it would be a more involved update, which we expect would involve more engagement. So yeah, those are kind of the considerations. That's the report.
Thank you, Fraser. We have a few questions from council. First, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question on that. Would this require them to have insurance and or be registered with ICBC?
Yeah, through the chair, I reached out to ICBC as part of my investigating. They are required, you need to have a driver's license to operate them, and the vehicle needs to be insured, and one of the Motor Vehicle Safety Act requirements is that it has like a VIN, vehicle identification number, so yes.
Yeah, so then a golf cart could be used so long as they have their insurance and, because that meets the definition, because most of them can go 35 kilometers, so.
Yeah, through the chair, so that is one distinction with the slow-moving vehicles. It would be, it's not kind of limited to that, the safety requirements that are applied to NZEVs otherwise, so that would be the case that would be allowed within the current bylaw, which is our current regulatory environment. With the NZEVs specifically, golf carts, there are differences in terms of the safety requirements that they have, and yeah, the registration and all that.
Thank you.
Councillor Gesselbrock.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to see this report finally recirculate to council, and maybe it's the added capacity in the department. But anyhow, I initially moved this forward because we have like an NZEV manufacturer up in Arrington, and that do great work, and these vehicles are being used all over North America, and they reached out and were like, we can't even use them in the city of Nanaimo. It would be great to like have the opportunity for local procurement opportunities in that, but the regulatory environment doesn't allow for it. So that initiated the conversation with staff, and then eventually to put this motion forward to investigate into it. And it is kind of interesting that our current bylaws allow for it that were made in 1993. So, and really all it is that you just have to put like a fluorescent triangle on the back of the vehicle, and then it's allowed. So somewhere there was lost communication or understanding between there, and I didn't have an opportunity to phone those folks up there to see if that is reasonable. But it'd be worthwhile reaching out to them, I would say, to see, because like if really that all is the requirement is to put an orange thing, and for some reason they were told before maybe that it wasn't allowed, then I just want to make sure that's sorted out. And this could have been done a lot quicker. Yeah, so I guess that's my question is like, is that really all that is required?
Yeah, through the chair. So I assume that's CanEV, is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I did speak with them in kind of doing some digging with this report. I was mainly reaching out to get an understanding of kind of where the market is. So in that discussion, it sounds like they're more kind of working with manufacturing, kind of like private side vehicle usage. I don't think I specifically asked them their perspective on this approach, so I can certainly follow up on that. But yeah, that was, I did speak with them there.
Okay, great, thanks.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, if I may, a question for staff. So excuse my ignorance, but I can't help but believe that a number of viewers would have the same question, and that is, what exactly are we talking about here? What is an NZEV? We're told in the report that it doesn't refer to mobility scooters and so on. Does it refer to golf carts? Is it a special separate type of vehicle that Councillor Gesselbrock knows much more about than I do? Could you just clarify, please?
Yeah, through the chair. So the golf cart analogy is generally how it comes up. It's essentially a golf cart that's just had a lot more safety features added and kind of met several different requirements in that regard. But in terms of kind of size and operating capacity, it's not dissimilar to that. Yeah, sorry, I think that's, it's I'm trying to think of other analogies.
Yeah, and I'm just curious and wondering, is it something separate specifically from your average golf cart? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so, I mean, I think where I'm getting stuck in my brain is that there's no set definition for what the NZEV is, but typically they end up having like doors and they're like an enclosed vehicle, a lot of them. Like I was mentioning, a lot of them are used for industrial settings, manufacturing, where they have like a little flatbed, not dissimilar from some of the little Japanese trucks that you see around. Yeah, but that's not necessarily the definition of it. So that's, yeah.
Okay, I think that helps me, thank you.
Councillor Manley.
Thank you. Yeah, if all it takes is a little orange triangle, and I don't have a problem with just sticking with the status quo. I have one of those. I can hook it up to the seat of my bicycle or put it on my backpack if I like, and you can find them at your local biking store or Canadian Tire for that matter. So I'd be happy to move option one.
Seconded? Okay.
Yeah, I said my piece.
Okay. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Yeah, just on the website of CanEV, you can check it out, but basically they look like the size of those smaller Japanese trucks that imported, but you can put like waste collection receptacles on the back, transporting goods, and the use cases is for smaller areas where, you know, they're very cheap to operate and can get into tighter areas. So.
Any other discussion? Councillor Armstrong.
Sorry, I have one question. When I looked at this again, one of the things that it says, it's an electric low-weight, low-speed vehicles, maximum 40 kilometers federally. So how will because the federal supersedes a municipal bylaw, so how would that work?
Through the chair, is the question,
Well,
Sorry.
we were allowing up to 50 kilometers, but the federally, it doesn't allow it to go over 40 kilometers.
my understanding through the chair is that the 40 kilometers an hour is that the vehicles aren't allowed to exceed that speed. It's not, in terms of the requirements around the vehicle, that's not about the posted speed limits that they're able to go on, if I'm understanding correctly.
It's vehicle
Okay.
capability, not regulatory speed.
Got it, thank you. Appreciate it.
Any discussion, council? Okay, call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you very much, Fraser. Which brings us to, oh boy. There we go. I have too many pages here. Prosperous Nanaimo. Development cost charge and amenity cost charge engagement and economic analysis update. Mr. Sims.
Thanks, Chair, appreciate it. Council's well aware that we've been sort of picking away at the development cost charge bylaw and amenity cost charge bylaw work, and that we have with us today, this is maybe the latest step in the process. We've developed the project list, we've developed the potential costing, presented that to council in January with a couple of, or pardon me, July, with a couple of different options on what to select, and council selected the sort of middle of the road option. The next step that we were going to do was a couple of an economic analysis. So we've got consultants from both Urban Systems and KPMG who have done economic analysis two different ways. One's on the online, I believe. We're expecting him to join. One of the key pieces of development cost charges is that I'd like to plant here is that with city plan, with the growth that Nanaimo has seen and continues to see and will continue to see, or we expect to continue to see, contributing to the overall national need for housing, is really a conversation about infrastructure. And so the thing that I like to say in a simple way is no sewers, no houses. So this is sort of at a fundamental level describing that there's no point in building houses if you've got no place to flush toilets or water to drink, etc. And so fundamentally DCCs are to support that growth. And I won't say much more, but I'll pass it over to Mr. Rosen, who will introduce the consultants. Thank you.
Mr. Rosen.
Thank you, Chair, Council. I won't repeat Mr. Sims's introduction, but I will say that just following the June 23rd GPC, Council selected the middle of the road DCC rates and directed staff to proceed with a number of action items. I believe there was 6 of those. So we've completed 2 of them to date, and so this is an interim follow-up to the complete package of motions that Council had established at that point. So at this point, we've completed the public engagement, and we've completed the economic impact assessment of the proposed rates. So we're going to update Council on what we've heard, and we have 3 presenters. We have 2 folks here in person from Urban Systems, Laura Bernier and Sean Heffernan, and then online we have a fellow from KPMG named Ian Smedley who's going to chime in a little bit later on his piece. So we'll start off with Urban Systems, and then once the presentations are complete, we'll follow up with a bit of next steps and answer some questions.
Great. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much. So as Mayor and Council know, we've been working on this project for quite some time. We are really, as Paul mentioned, getting to a point where we've done a lot of the engagement with the development community and want to have Council receive some of that feedback that we've heard. So, really we're trying to create a basket of goods and a rate that will support infrastructure on the whole in the city of Nanaimo and make sure that it can be, sustainably managed and funded for time to come. Today, as we mentioned, we'll debrief on the engagement as well as a brief economic summary of our economic analysis and welcome any questions on those pieces. So in terms of best practice for development cost charges and amenity cost charges, the best practice guide, puts forward the practice of engaging with key interested parties on the ACCs and DCCs. That can typically involve developers, realtors, the public, and any other community groups. So, engaging with these relevant parties is important. For DCCs, it is not required. However, for ACCs, it is required by the new legislation. So all of the feedback is included in a memo that summarizes all of the kind of open house materials and the survey materials that were a part of this process. So key to this was in September and in October, we launched public consultation with an online survey and a public open house. And so that was published on the Get Involved page in September. It's still live on the Get Involved page. The survey has since closed. And it was also published on the Nanaimo Bulletin on October 1st, as you can see here. So it was a very successful engagement on the whole. For the open house, we received a whopping 52 attendance, which is much higher than normal for a process that's highly technical like this. We received lots of folks from the real estate community, development community. We received members of the public, and people who were interested in the environmental impacts and infrastructure impacts. So that was held on October 9th from 4 to 7 at the Bevan Park Social Center. And really, folks were encouraged to engage with the panels, engage in discussion with the consultants and the staff team that was there, and ask lots of questions. So here, as you'll note in the package, there was lots of great feedback that we heard throughout the process. Much of it was in line with what we expected to hear. So developers are concerned that the rates could negatively impact housing affordability and development viability. There were questions specifically about detached secondary suites and small scale housing and how the impact of rates might affect those types of uses. There was lots of suggestions on how to improve development viability. Key to this was improving things like timelines and building permit requirements. And then, another key point here was around the municipal assist factor. So some of the comments were related to increasing the level of assistance in general, broadly across the DCCs and ACC rates. Other comments were about kind of phasing in DCCs and ACCs given current market conditions and, trends in some of these costs. And then lots of implementation questions and pieces like that. Anything to add there from Sean? You were also at that engagement. Lots of great conversations were had.
Yeah, I think it was generally like a pretty productive dialogue. I think a lot of the comments are, again, things that are pretty typical through this process. There's always, friction when it comes to change in these rates, and they do have an impact. But I do think overall it was a productive discussion.
So in addition to the public open house, there was also a survey that was open for about 5 weeks between September 22nd and October 24th. We got 62 responses through that, and we got some, very detailed comments from that as well. And so in general, part of what we wanted to hear was the level of support on proposed rates from all kinds of communities, both developer community and the public, as well as the level of desire for increased or decreased financial assistance through the municipal assist factor, the phase-in of proposed rates, waivers and reductions, and then additional comments and feedback. So Very similar themes were reflected both in the open house and in the survey. We did want to, summarize each of these with some of the best practice or, comments from other engagements that we've heard, which is what's kind of highlighted in gold there. And so really what we heard was, again, concern around affordability and development, barriers to housing. A lot of respondents were reportedly against the DCC rates in the survey. So many of the respondents, were members of the community. There was also developers as part of that. So people voiced concern about those higher rates. This is quite common feedback that we hear through these processes, and we did conduct economic viability testing on some of those that we'll present later that shows what the actual impacts are.
Yeah, and I was just going to note too that, it is very, for the surveys that we conduct, it is, you often get pretty big divide between those members of the public who are looking for greater support in the funding and, contributions towards those infrastructure pieces that we're talking about through the DCCs and ACCs, and then the developers who are paying the fees. So the surveys can tend to be very split in that way.
Yeah, and interestingly, many answers on whether people felt supportive or negatively. Despite that, a lot of the feedback received through actual comments were in support of using development fees for supporting infrastructure projects, especially when it was, tied to service capacity and asset management issues. And there are projects that can be targeted as priority for addressing multiple issues at one time. But as we know, asset management and O&M is not eligible for DCCs directly. So all of the projects that are included in the program are supportive of growth. However, that comment was received and interesting. And then there's just interest, I think, in greater financial transparency in general. DCC and DCC specifically, the financial reporting is publicly accessible, and the DCC bylaw and background reports are available to the public at the front desk. So it's quite a transparent process.
I think one thing to consider in this too is that I think there's an appreciation for DCC programs when they're implemented. I think there's definitely some of the feedback that we received during the open house is like making sure if you're going to collect the money that it's getting spent and getting spent in a timely manner, not kind of collecting dust in reserve funds. I think that's kind of an important side of things. I think those working in the industry understand the necessity of these. The alternative would be a kind of a pure negotiated approach, which could be very time-consuming and costly for both the city and the developers. But in that, I think there's kind of, the hope the city will actually follow through and make sure these projects are delivered in a timely manner. I think that's a big part of some of the feedback we received too.
A couple other pieces here. So interest in making sure that DCCs and ACCs are aligned with other documents. As we noted here, a lot of the growth estimates and other key inputs are aligned with the OCP, transportation networks and corridors that are increasing in density. And I think there's interest here in, I think, lately in the current market with the desire to incentivize denser forms of housing, we do hear a lot that there's a desire to incentivize certain types of housing, which is, of course, not something that you can do under the DCC legislation. There's some mixed support around a phased-in approach, and then as well some mixed responses on how growth should be funding, whether that comes from taxation or development fees. Couple of other pieces here. I think this is one of our last slides on this, but a key question was around waivers and reductions. So this is a little bit of a more nuanced piece. Not everyone is going to access waivers and reductions for DCCs. They're only eligible for certain types or forms of housing. However, it was noted that about 40% of respondents felt that they were effectively being used. There's always going to be some trade-offs with some of those pieces, but we did want to ask that question around whether there should be some ideas considered on waivers and reductions, especially as staff are looking to review the waivers and reductions bylaw through this process. A very common thing is around timelines. This will also come up in our economic feasibility assessment. Timelines and underground parking and things like that can greatly impact development. So we see here rezoning approval timelines are a big theme of some of the feedback we heard, as well as some of the in-stream relief options and in-stream kind of grace periods that are available to developers. Okay, so we wanted to review some of the economic analysis pieces that Urban Systems has put together, and then we'll pass it over to the folks at KPMG.
If we can, I think we have one question there for.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair, if I may, and I apologize for interrupting, but before we move on, I'm just curious, it mentions in several places in your report about the response to the idea of phasing in, and you indicate there was support from that basically in the open house, and the survey spoke to that. I'm just really curious about if you could elaborate on the reason for the mixed support of phasing in. Does that mean that some people were more in favor of just doing it right now, or does it mean that some people were in favor of not doing it at all?
That's through the chair. That's a wonderful question. I think we'd have to go into some of the detailed feedback responses to make sure I understand the sentiment around those. When we talk about mixed support, the questions were quite direct to say, do you support a phased-in approach or not? And respondents reflected kind of on a sliding scale whether they were in favor or not. However, we did have a lot of detailed feedback responses that we can take a look for as well. I think it does align with the fact that different forms of support come from different parties, and so where we see taxpayers understanding that this burden will be shifted onto taxpayers, where the municipal assist factor is increased, typically there'll be less support for something like municipal assistance or a phased-in approach. Typically, developers are very supportive of it, as it supports with pro forma development and easing in the rates over time, essentially.
Right, yes, I got that. Okay, thanks very much.
I was just going to add, I think, in a sense too, I think it's probably a bit of both to your question, that there is probably those in the group that are just probably like no DCCs, and they would rather not have any, and then there's probably on the taxpayer side that said, we would prefer not be phased in because there's a cost to that too. So the survey does kind of walk through that, and that would be reflective of some of the conversations in that open house as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And we have Councillor Armstrong as well.
Thank you. In the surveys, there was concerns about the costs going up and escalating and the viability of projects. So when I was researching this, I was looking at stories written by Stories and BIV, where they're showing in Vancouver that is having a big impact on development there, that some projects are no longer viable because of the increased costs. So, and then that is also leading to increased rents, as well as a lot of buildings not going forward. Did you find that here?
Through the chair, we'll go through some of the analysis here, and that isn't what we discovered. We didn't discover that DCCs were at the root of developments predominantly becoming not viable, rather that there was existing conditions in the market that are leading to lack of viability in most cases. The rates in the Lower Mainland are quite different than on the island as well. However, there was a recent report also released, I think a couple of weeks ago, that also noted the economic conditions are quite difficult in the market right now as well. Trond, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a good chance to kind of go over to our update on the economic analysis side of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because through our research, there's definitely a lot of challenges in the market right now. ACCs and DCCs certainly are not helpful in that regard, but they're not kind of the main culprits of kind of what is causing kind of the lack of development viability. So there is a change in the DCC rates, and they're going up fairly significantly here in Nanaimo, but they're still kind of in a 1% to 3% overall kind of range in terms of the costs of an actual development, and things like financing costs, construction costs, labor costs are all things that are actually having a much more significant impact, right? So we're looking at some developments, if they're a negative 8% return, like yes, the ACC and DC update may push them to a negative 9% return, kind of thing. So some are they're still having an impact, but is it the thing that's pushing development into unviability? And I think that's where we're not seeing that ACCs and DCCs are kind of the sole culprit there. And in fact, other things you know, can have a pretty significant ability to kind of move the dial in that regard too. So that's just maybe a bit of an overview of kind of what we discovered. But in terms of presentations, like basically the reason why we did that economic analysis, because there's high level legislation for the DCCs that says, you know, the imposition of development cost charges should not discourage discourage reasonable price housing and reasonable price land for development. So that's an interesting kind of high level test to see, okay, is that the actual factor that makes development or housing unviable? ACCs does actually provide a bit more detail in terms of the requirement for economic analysis. It does say that it could be required by the Lieutenant Governor if they deem an ACC bylaw as potentially negatively impacting the delivery of reasonably priced housing and land. So there's not necessarily a best practice for what that measure is. Say, okay, this is the threshold in which this is the cause, or is that's too high? So it does kind of leave us in a bit of a subjective space for how we actually evaluate that overall. So we did take a look at a number of analysis, and there was again 2 analyses, one done by ourselves at Urban, the other done by KPMG, that kind of looks at like residual land values and the kind of the impact of the fees and charges on development viability. So we'll kind of present some of the details of Urban's findings here. You want to carry it on?
Oh. Sorry. There we go. Yeah. So I think we have covered, you know, quite a few of the key findings here, you know, that were identified through this study. There were some changes to viability based on the results of testing out a variety of different construction types in different land use categories. And as Sean alluded to there, it typically impacts the profitability and profit margins by up to 1 to 3% in each of those, across all of those categories. So a key part of ensuring that developments were viable was not only land prices and construction costs and all of those pieces. Parking also played a significant role in that, and we've also heard, as I mentioned earlier, timelines can play significant roles here. So we did test out some of the different parking requirements throughout this as well, and that was a significant leveraging point on those pieces. And you'll see here, this is a summary table of some of the discoveries through that analysis, where you have the development type on the left-hand side, and then that middle column demonstrates the viability under the current DCC regime and whether those forms of development are viable or not, versus against the proposed DCC and ACC regime on the right-hand side. So you'll see here, kind of in the green zone, those are viable projects where the profit on the cost margins are at least 15% or greater. And then you have those beige ones, which are potentially viable. You know, it depends on some of the different inputs that are used in the analysis across those different housing types, and the profit margins are, profit on cost margins are between 10 and 15%. And anything below 10% was noted as unviable.
Yeah, I'll note too that this is kind of based on the notion that this is if you were to kind of walk in and buy a piece of land today and kind of proceed with a development proposition on some of the sites that we looked at. So there's a pretty big range, and this obviously would change a lot depending on the time in which the land was purchased, and you know, other things that you know, in terms of access to certain materials and the types of buildings that they're constructing could have a pretty significant influence on this. I think one thing to note was the wood frame development. We do note there that it generally showed up as unviable. However, it could be shifted into viable with changes to parking and other things like that. So underground parking can be quite expensive for development. You know, it can be like up to $70,000 a stall, which can make a really big difference. You know, and the viability of that. So again, it's highlighting that, you know, ACCs and DCCs are one part of a larger equation where we're seeing a lot of cost inflation, a lot of cost impacts as well. And these are the same cost impacts that are actually impacting the program itself. The cost of infrastructure is also increasing. So, you know, the economy as a whole is basically, you know, struggling a bit with these increasing costs of materials and labor. And how that's kind of playing out here. is definitely focusing on some bigger picture items that go kind of beyond the DCCs and ACCs themselves.
Okay, this slide has triggered a few questions, so we'll maybe
sure it has.
pause on that one before we move on. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. It is again on the profit margins, right? Like, it's hard for us to know what a profit margin's gonna be for some place, and do we trust when the developer comes forward? So I appreciate the fact that you're looking at least 15% and 10 to 15%, da-da-da. Do we know what the average profitability rate is of development in Nanaimo? Like, what, is there a percentage you can give us, or is it each project separate, or is there a rough estimate?
Through the chair, it varies so vastly, and by geography and by each of these typologies, there'd be no kind of typical average, and it would be really based on that, a whole number of factors that would be incredibly site specific. So, yeah, there's not a kind of an average level of profitability, so to speak. Most developers will not proceed below 15%. Some will, depending on certain conditions and where they're at, with some of that potentially viable zone of 10 to 15. So if you're seeing a development proceed, it's pretty fair to assume they're probably aiming to achieve at least 10%.
So the way I'm reading this is basically the only thing that's viable to build here right now is a townhouse.
Yeah, if you were to come in to buy a piece of property today, and that's not universally true. Again, it depends when you bought the land. If you're to kind of come today and buy that land,
True, yeah.
Townhouse would probably be the one that is probably most viable. Again, it depends on the site. We didn't test every site in Nanaimo. What we did is we worked with planning to select a number of representative sites, and those with development potential, with the appropriate zoning and site areas and things like that. Things that the developers may be targeting from their perspective as viable sites, and that's what we tested. So there may be things that are more viable in some of those categories, but generally it is a pretty challenging environment for them. And I think that's some of the feedback that's coming through on the phasing side of things, is that, particularly now the economics are quite difficult.
Thank you.
Mayor Kirk.
Thank you very much, Chair, and through you, I have a friend who's a contractor who's finally retired, and cost plus is always the cost plus 15%, and if it's not, he's not doing it. And so what these figures confirm, I think, for me is, honestly, whatever the DCC is, even within the high range, the low range, the middle range, it's not going to make any significant difference unless the economy, so to speak, the marketplace is there. And that's a fair comment, and I see nodding heads and just confirming what you've already said. Much appreciate this. And I'm glad it's in a public place today being discussed and put out, so that council can rely on it on whatever we may or may not do with the DCCs, so that perhaps some of the more vociferous complaints that do come from some people might be answered. Thank you.
Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Chair. This information in this slide really kind of stymied me. So thank you for the comments, which I agree with. My question, though, and I'm not even sure if it's for you guys or for my colleagues, but if we're already determining that development is unviable across these sectors, and we're hearing that, well, DCCs or ACCs just present this little minor blip, it's actually labor costs and construction costs, we're still adding costs. We're, even though we're not, DCCs and ACCs are not driving it, or AACs not driving it, we're still compounding it in an environment where 4 out of 5 categories are unbuildable. So I don't think that's a question. I think that's just a statement. Here's a question, though. There was, peppered throughout the report, the engagement report, there was a comment about phasing. So if city decided to phase this out, say we go with the moderate road and we phase it over 3 to 5 years, would it budge any of these categories?
So through the chair, under the current regime, so if there was a phase-in approach, it wouldn't reduce DCCs any further than under the current. And so I think where there could be, potential shifting is around townhouse and the wood frame development potentially. It would be difficult. You'd have to kind of undertake a similar analysis to understand to what point that would impact those. But I think really there are some other levers here as well that would come alongside that to ensure that those weren't the tipping points, like parking requirements.
Yeah, I think it would have to be thought of kind of the amount of phase in and the amount of time and like relative to that impact. I don't think it would be necessarily a deciding factor in those ones that are kind of proposed, and if their current viability is unviable, the phase in isn't going to make those viable, and it's the viable and the potentially viable, I guess, would frame if you make some parking regulation changes and other things that you might start to see a difference, but again, it probably wouldn't be like a significant, wouldn't kind of shift a whole bunch of development into viability or anything like that. It could provide a little breathing space as the market adjusts to some of the current economic challenges. I think that's probably the feedback that I heard at the open house, was that, oh yeah, like a phase in of a couple of years could give a bit more of a break for those projects that are in progress and that are potentially already in the process of proceeding, and just allow for a little more time for things like labor costs and construction costs and financing costs to stabilize prior to kind of having the full rate brought in. But I think given what we've shown, it would probably have a relatively modest impact on development viability, if any.
If I could just add, the practical way a phased-in approach would transpire would be a time-based approach on the municipal assist factor. So if you recall, we have a minimum 1% municipal assist factor that we're required through the Act to apply. And there's a couple of categories, water supply and RCMP, where we applied a 25% municipal assist factor. That additional funding has to be made up through other means, whether it's the water utility, sewer utility, general taxation, and so on and so forth. And so if we were to have a phased in or like a time-based adjusted municipal assist factor, it creates quite a bit of complication around how to manage that, especially if we have projects, DCC projects that we're completing in a given fiscal year. What municipal assist factors are we applying? And so it gets quite complex for our finance department to be able to administer this kind of a phased in adjusted municipal assist factor. And just anecdotally, I was just talking to Ms. Fuller, our Director of Finance. When I talked to her about this, she was a little bit concerned about the amount of additional staff effort it required to be able to administer a phased-in approach like this. So it's just a bit of a cautionary note that it's not straightforward to create a phased-in municipal assist factor. So just leave it there.
I will also kind of note, building on that too, that bringing in a DCC program does trigger what's referred to as an in-stream protection period, where developments are given a 12-month, and in-stream applications are given 12-month kind of grandfathering of the previous DCC rates. So the new DCC rates would not necessarily come in effect on those current applicants immediately. So they would have some time to actually adjust to that as well. So just reminding council of that obligation as well.
Sure.
Council, Mr. Sims.
Thanks, Chair. Just really briefly, we're certainly conscious of the sentiment expressed by Councillor Hemmons around we're adding a cost. And I think there's further perspective to be added by Mr. Smedley as well in this discussion. But I might ask that Mr. Rosen speak a little bit about the land value, equate part of this equation, because I think that's where the viability and that's the preponderance of any costs at this point in our economic life.
So I think what Mr. Sims was referring to, I was talking to him earlier about this. So as part of our economic analysis, and Mr. Smedley will speak to this as well, but as part of an overall development pro forma, there's a whole bunch of costs that go into that, including land costs, build costs, financing costs, permit costs. Like there's a lot of costs that go into that transaction, and that'll ultimately will result in a total cost for that development. Then there'll obviously be what they can market that for and sell it for. So what we're talking about here is that the amount that it creates to create that development is more than what they can market it for in a general sense. There'll obviously be some specific projects that can find, better market conditions, lower costs, and they can make things work. One of the things that is quite important to note here, though, is the land value is a very significant portion of that developer's cost. But it's one of the only costs that can fluctuate through time. Like, what is the land value worth in a given development transaction. So when a developer is looking for a potential parcel to do a development on, the land sale transaction will extract as much value as it can out of that transaction. And the folks selling, they know how much they can push things, and they'll push things to the point where a developer is making their profit, and so they'll push it as far as they can. So what I'm saying is the land value transaction can go up and down, but it'll pull as much value as it can out of that transaction. If we increase the DCC rates, it'll have a bit of a temporary resetting factor on land values to for a period of time. It's hard to say how long. Could be 6 months, could be a year. But what it'll do is it'll have a bit of downward pressure on land value transactions for a period of time until things sort of restabilize. But I just wanted to point out that land value transaction is one of the only sort of variables in the overall equation.
Councillor Perino.
Thank you, Chair. I just, I found this particular slide shocking. And as Councillor Hammond said, and I agree 100%, when we add more and more costs, then it just takes it to that tipping point. The Prime Minister talked actually on a news brief. As I was reading the documents in preparation for today, the Prime Minister was talking about the need for more homes. And I'm like, how can you possibly expect us to build more homes when you've got, I mean, the time it takes to go from the document side to the time we start construction, to all the permit costs, to all the DCCs, now the ACCs, an additional cost, the land cost, the list is endless, and this is passed on to whoever moves into those homes. Whether it's an apartment, a townhouse, or single-family home, whatever it is, it's passed on to them. So we create an environment that makes it difficult for people to find, especially young families, to find accommodations, which I find really difficult, and this is where I think our federal government needs to step up and help more. But I wish we were not adding another cost. So I appreciate what your comments were, Councillor Hammonds. I wish that we could stop with the addition, because it sure makes it tough to see the end user get into a home.
Through the chair to council, if I may indulge the consultants, if one of our challenges is rising costs of providing our own infrastructure, which this is also related to, and so the challenge for council is balancing the construction costs of the construction business right now with spreading the costs amongst taxpayers who already have a tax burden. I wonder if you have any comments to that.
I'm just going to highlight, and happy to turn it over, but we do have a significant amount of presentation left, and I'm wondering if some of these questions that are borderline discussion might benefit from that presentation, but
yes, to that, I think it is, yeah, absolutely. These things are connected, right? And I think Paul did a good description there too of how that impacts land value. At the end of the day, DCCs and ACCs, they're not, the market dictates the price of housing. So they're not necessarily like placed on top of that saying, okay, yeah, whether your house is going to be, you know, apartments going to be $500,000 plus your DCC and ACC charges. They will sell their apartments for what they can sell their apartments for. But that being said, they do have an impact on, you know, what the costs that go into that. And of course you create supply and demand challenges in the long run when you don't have enough housing being constructed, and therefore, you know, the cost of the housing remaining will tend to go up. Right now we're in a period of time where developers are not able to achieve the prices they need for certain types of products that they're selling. To go back to that question too, it is kind of the same economy that we're all kind of involved in here, right? And I think that's the kind of the challenge is, as it was said, is trying to balance those things, balance the, you know, need to provide the infrastructure to support that growth. Because on the flip side, if the infrastructure is not there, then you have another problem with delivering the housing, because there's not enough sewer and water and parks and roads to actually like make that development viable as well too. So the projects on this list are meant to serve growth and meant to support growth and development. So without them, you face another challenge where you actually may not, you know, have the ability to bring on new sites for development as well, because you're not paying for the infrastructure or delivering that infrastructure fast enough to actually support that. So that's a key thing, and then your costs are going up at the same time too. So yeah, it is a challenging one, and it is about balance, I think, is kind of the key word there.
Councillor Gosar.
I have more comment than questions, so let's get done the presentation.
Perfect. Appreciate that restraint. Back to you.
Thanks for the questions. We don't have too many more on our end. We wanted to just recap some of our timelines on the DCC front. So many of the works have been completed. You'll note here a couple of the council engagements that have been done in November and in June, and then again today. And so really moving forward against a typical DCC process, short of receiving direction to look at anything else from here out, once the feedback from the engagement process has been received, the bylaw would be able to go to 3 readings for both the ACCs and DCCs, and the DCC would require a ministry submission, which could take between 6 and 8 weeks approximately, after which the DCC bylaw could be adopted, and the ACC bylaw could be adopted at any point afterwards, or sorry, after the DCCs and ACCs are presented for 3 readings. I think with that, we'll pass it over to, back to Paul here.
So I'll just introduce Ian Smedley from KPMG. They were tasked with an economic analysis that looked at the proportionate cost of DCCs through time. So looking at the year 2000, and then looking at what our current rates are, and then comparing that to the proposed rates. So I'll turn things over to Mr. Smedley, but I think he'll have to ask me to change the slides, because I don't think he can do that. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Smedley.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rosen. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well, thank you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Rosen, if you could just go to the next slide, please. So as Mr. Rosen mentioned, we were asked to look at historical development cost charges in the city of Nanaimo, specifically to understand their materiality relative to the overall cost of development. So what we have here is a breakdown of the various costs of a development on a single family dwelling. On the left, you see in the year 2000, at the bottom, the city of Nanaimo DCCs represented approximately 3% of the overall estimated sale price. In the year 2024, you'll see that percentage has decreased to 1%. So overall, as a percentage of the overall cost, DCCs declined, even while the estimated sale price increased. Mr. Rosen, if you could go to the next slide. In terms of comparison then, so at 1% in 2024, we looked at the new rates that were provided to us by staff, and under the new rates, a similar housing unit would be, the DCCs would represent 3%, so back to the similar percentage as it was in the year 2000. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. We also looked at a multifamily dwelling. So again, in the year 2000, DCCs were approximately 2% of the overall cost of a development. 2024, this amount had reduced slightly to 1% of the overall development. And then if you please provide the next slide. And then the comparison there. So again, 2024, under the current rates, 1%, and then under the new rates, the DCC rate comes back to 2%. So again, similar to the way they were in the year 2000, representing 2% of the overall cost. As with other examples, this is an illustrative example of hypothetical developments. Obviously, each individual development would have slightly different breakdowns, but this was meant to sort of provide an overview of the relative cost or relationship between DCC rates, both existing and potential future, relative to the overall development of a particular type of dwelling. And happy to take any questions.
Any questions, Council? Nope, Your Worship.
Thank you. Can we just go back to the first slide, land cost at 39,000? I think I must have completely lost my brains, but that's a single-family dwelling. Are we saying that in
2000?
the year 2000, 39,000 for a lot?
Yep.
Should have bought more land.
Yep. You could buy a house for 70,000 in this community.
We're talking, yeah, okay, sorry. Yes, no, now I figured it out. Thank you. Ignore me.
I do have one question as well. You know, projecting 20 years into the future, obviously difficult, but would it be safe to assume that the DCC rates would become, you know, if the, as proposed, were adopted, they would each year or average out to become a lower percentage of the overall cost of development? So that would be a question. If we were projecting, if the DCC rates as proposed were adopted and projected out over the next 20 years, would it be safe to assume that they would average out to become a smaller cost of development over that 20-year horizon?
Through the chair, I think if we were, and maybe I guess Ian can probably answer this as well. I think from our perspective, it would be difficult to understand exactly how the market would play out in the next 20 years. I don't think that it's anticipated that land prices continue to escalate in the same way that they have been. And so likely this is making up the difference. I think, you know, over the past 5-10 years, there's been significant, you know, significant changes in the market. And I think there is an expected cooling of that. So it is anticipated to equal out a little bit. Sean, maybe you want to elaborate.
Yeah, and I think of, you know, again, I think Ian can maybe speak to his presentation here, but I think what we see is between the last update and now, it's been a number of years. We've looked at just over 5 years, and in that time, when they were first brought in, they were probably a higher proportion of the overall development costs, and 5 years goes by, and that proportion gets smaller and smaller, and that's why we do these updates, you know, fairly frequently, is to ensure that they're consistent and kept up to date with the cost of construction and infrastructure. So typically they're, you know, if we're looking back historically in the last 20 years, I think as a new program comes in, it's kind of a higher proportion of the overall development, and then as time goes on, if the, you know, the market continues as it has in the last 20 years, then it will continue to get smaller and smaller as property values, you know, increase and so on and so forth. So, and inflation continues to happen as well too, right? They become just proportionally less. So again, to Laura's point, we don't know exactly what will happen in the next, you know, 5-20 years, but you know, if we see kind of trends progress as they currently have, or maybe with lower levels of inflation, yeah, they will continue to become a less and less factor over time.
Okay, then that kind of brings me to my core question then. What is the relevancy of the 1 to 3% and comparing it to the past, you know, 20 years ago, other than just to say it matches?
This is probably a question for Mr. Smedley.
Yeah, that's him.
Sure, thank you. So through the chair, what I can say about the cost charges is that the charges from the year 2000 to the year 2024, the development cost charges were changed. So the bylaw governing this changed 5 times. So they typically change every 5 years. So so every 5 to 6 years, these charges have been updated. And so what we're demonstrating and showing that there's a change between 3% and 1%, it's that over time, the bylaw has maintained that level of charge. Every time it's been changed, it's been within that range. So I think my colleagues from Urban Systems mentioned that the range typically is 1 to 3%. And so what this is meant to demonstrate is that even though the bylaws have changed and the way DCCs have been calculated over time has changed, it has always been to maintain that amount sort of roughly between that 1 and 3%. So that's what it's meant to represent.
Okay, thank you.
That this new proposed amount would also be within that 1 to 3%.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. When you're showing the building cost breakdown, you've included DCCs, obviously, because that's what we're talking about. But is there any breakdown that what it would cost the taxpayer if we didn't do a DCC? Like, I'm seeing all this information on this is what the developer's going to pay, but I don't see anything about if we did not have our DCC bylaw, what would be the average impact to a taxpayer for the new infrastructure? And I know that's a hard question to answer because it depends on development, but using our history of how many new subdivisions going in and whatever, is there a rough guesstimate?
I don't have that information. We didn't look at the offshoot of what the infrastructure required would look like and what the alternative would be.
Because for me, that's an important thing, because I hear that from the taxpayers all the time, that, you know what, it's wrong that you're charging the DCCs, it's making, you know, costs higher, So when I reply back, well, if we don't do that, then we need to tax you, then the question is, well, what would our taxation rate be if we had to?
Chair, I think that certainly the funding would have to come from somewhere. And currently the municipal assist factor is set typically at 1%, which means that the taxpayer funds 1% of DCC projects, except where there's a definite benefit to existing, so there may be, some benefit to the existing taxpayer. But the basic premise always is, if we stopped any growth today, then there would be no need for the projects that we've shown as growth projects. We would still need to continue to do the asset management work, the replacement of underground infrastructure. Some of the work that both FCM has done nationally, and I've sort of scaled it down to local, is that every single housing unit engenders about $100,000 in infrastructure, whether that's city facilities, airports, sidewalks, sewer, water. So that's kind of a rough, that's the replacement value of infrastructure. We're not replacing it all at the same time, but for every new housing unit, there's about 100,000 in replacement value of infrastructure that the city supports. I just bring that up to say that housing is expensive. The housing discussion is really an infrastructure discussion. So if our infrastructure can support growth, support housing, and I certainly appreciate the consternation around the sticker shock. We all suffer from it. Seeing that $48,000 for a single family is a shock. But it's still a long way from fully supporting, in my view, fully supporting growth. But it's certainly a balanced approach. The other observation that I might make is that we fixate on that single-family dwelling charge of $48,000. We saw in the one chart with the nice colors, the red, yellow, green, that the single family was not viable. And quite frankly, I don't know if there's a direct correlation, but certainly there's a trend that council's seen over the last number of years that the number of single-family dwellings is declining relative to the number. We're still delivering 1,100 or more housing units a year, but significantly lower in single-family, significantly higher in townhouse and multifamily, which is more on the viability scale. So I think that the demonstration that Mr. Holmes' department's already sort of seen over the last, let's call it 4 or 5 years, is sort of borne out in that chart. I'm not saying there's a direct connection, but it's that sort of, there is that correlation. So and we all fixate on that single family piece, but it's really the multifamily that's where the money seems to be going, both viability and DCCs.
So I can just add a little bit, probably a bit more context for Councillor Armstrong's question. So the DCC program is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's very, very large, and it's forecast over several decades. And it's really just the infrastructure required to support that growth. It's not the asset management piece, that's been stripped out. It's really just that piece of infrastructure required for the more people, like it's the greater water supply capacity, sewer, like roads, that sort of thing. So if you were to look at it from the perspective of what the impact would be on taxation, if you take hundreds of millions of dollars and you divide it by 20 years, you're looking at a very large annual number to continue to support development. So that the revenue would have to come from somewhere, otherwise we can't have the growth, because the infrastructure is just not there.
I think through the chair to do some really rough math here, when you look at the program, the DCC program itself is recovering something around $600 million, which is just the DCC program itself. So if a 1% tax increase is something like 1.3 million, that's like an 18% annual tax increase. So it's very significant.
That's why I wanted on the table so people understand.
Councillor Manley.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious about the development part, because we're looking at a lot of density. So those density projects, they require larger sewer pipes, larger water pipes. That's all that's covered under the DCC program as well as asset management? Is there, it's kind of a mixed bag, or is it DCC? Like, for example, Metro Drive, we're seeing a lot of larger development going in there now. That project is completed. Would that have partially come from DCCs, underground infrastructure?
So for any given project, it's often funded as a combination of DCC, general revenue, maybe water utility, sewer utility. They're quite often these concurrent projects that we put together. And they could be driven by asset management, they could be driven by growth pressures, and so on and so forth. The DCC program, you know, revenue generates some funding that is only used for the growth portion. It's not used for the asset management piece.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, that was kind of my understanding, just looking for that explanation. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and just for a little context too, so your current program is sitting at 1.16 billion total, of which only 600 million of that is the DCC eligible portion. So you're kind of looking at kind of roughly a 50-50 split, or slightly more, maybe 55% of those total costs are actually the DCC portion. The rest of it is the renewal portion. So every project is evaluated and allocated a portion benefit to new growth and development.
And when we get a project like Metro Drive, where the works and services have been completed underground, the DCCs from those density projects will then just go into other DCC projects in the community.
The DCC revenue comes into the reserves for, like, we have a separate reserve for water and sewer and transportation. And so the revenue we would get from those building permits would go into that reserve.
Yep.
And then the next highest priority project would get applied the funding. It may not be in the same location, but we sort of prioritize the growth projects throughout as we normally do as part of capital planning. We have asset management, we have growth, we have strategic stuff. We mix it all together and we develop some recommendations.
Okay, great, thank you.
Just one thing I thought it would be worth just mentioning, that we heard as part of the engagement is a bit of a misnomer out there about what municipalities are allowed to use DCC funds for. We're not allowed to use them for asset management projects. I think there is this misunderstanding out there. So just to make it clear, like, the Act prevents the municipalities from using DCC funds for asset management purposes, really just for that growth infrastructure.
I have no one up here on the queue, so I don't know if there's any more presentation here, or?
The only thing I was just going to mention a little bit on next steps, just to give council a bit of a heads up on what's coming. So given what we heard today, we didn't anticipate that there was going to be a lot of anticipated appetite for change from council, although council can obviously pass a motion if you want to redirect staff. But we're intending to complete the remainder of those additional 4 motions, so essentially set the bylaws up for council and return with an opportunity for council to pass those bylaws. It'll probably be in February of 26. And then from there, the province has to approve the DCC bylaw, and then upon 4th reading, it would be adopted, and then council would have to choose an implementation date to go along with that. So that's essentially the next steps, unless council has any sort of redirection for us.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. A question regarding the engagement. Did anything change as a result of workshopping this with the development community?
Sorry, the question was, has anything changed?
Yeah, so we made a decision, and then we sent you guys out to do this engagement. We've now got an engagement report back with the exact same decision in front of us. Did staff contemplate any changes or any suggested revisions based on what you heard from the development community? And I think the point I'm trying to make is, did we just engage to say that we engaged, or did we engage and hear it and change things?
I think there was a comment in the report that maybe some feedback, maybe I'm wrong here, but.
Through the chair, we, I think, wanted to present the feedback to Mayor and Council to understand what appetite would be for maintaining and carrying forward this rate. If there's a desire to investigate how the municipal assist factor can play into things, or if there's other levers to be directed to follow up on, we're certainly open to receiving direction in that regard. However, this was more to present feedback to understand what next steps would be to finalizing a program.
Yes, and in addition to that too, like there was not substantial feedback on any of the technical elements of the program that would change any of the assumptions made in the program itself too. So we didn't receive information like that project doesn't make any sense, or there's good questions, but yeah, there's nothing that really let us change the underlying technical components of the program, which is what's really driving the cost now.
And given the importance of generating the revenue for the infrastructure, we are just recommending to stay the course.
See. Thank you. And this question might have been asked and answered. I apologize if so, but there were also some comments in the report about transparency of when you pay DCCs, ensure that they're going to where they're going to go, and then we're not sitting on them in a reserve. Could I have any comments on that? I understood DCC bylaws to be really quite clear. This is where we're putting your money. This is the project it's attached to. So is that just maybe a lack of knowledge on the other side? Or is there really is there something I don't understand when they say I don't know where my DCCs are going? It's a weird way of putting it, but I think you get me.
So the Act prevents us from spending that money on anything but DCC-specific projects. And obviously, our finance department has a lot of controls in place to ensure that that is how things play out, as well as the city is audited regularly. And so the odds of the city spending DCC money on something non-DCC is essentially impossible.
Thank you.
And sorry, Councillor Hemmons, I read since the June 23rd, 2025 council, not since the engagement session, so it said there was some minor changes, but I assume that was before the engagement session. Yeah, okay. Anything else from council? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. No further direction, we can anticipate the bylaws in February. Thank you. Which brings us to question period, which we have no questions, which brings us to adjournment. Moved by Councillor Gusselbrock, second by Councillor Hemmons. All those in favor? Thanks.
I never.